I've been camping alone for years, and while there's always that faint sense of unease being out in the wild, nothing ever made me question my safety. But last September something happened that changed the way I look at solo trips. I set up camp in a small clearing about a mile off a secluded trail in Wyoming. The place was perfect: dense pines for cover, a small creek nearby, and absolute silence except for nature's sounds. As night crept in, I started a fire, cooked dinner, and settled in with a book, wrapped in the usual comfort of the wilderness. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, a slow, steady crunching of leaves just beyond my firelight. At first, I thought it might be a deer, maybe even a bear. But something felt off. I reached for my flashlight, and when I turned it on, I caught sight of a figure, a man. He was just standing there, barely visible behind the trees, watching me. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound as unfazed as possible. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't move. He didn't respond. He just stood there, half hidden in the dark, hands in his pockets. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, but I kept my flashlight pointed directly at him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the fire burning and my flashlight within reach, my ears straining for any sound. Every time a branch snapped or a leaf rustled, I felt a surge of adrenaline. Morning couldn't come fast enough. At dawn, I packed up my gear as quickly as possible. I didn't see any sign of the man when I left, but as I hiked back to my car, I felt eyes on me. Every few minutes, I'd stop and look over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there watching me. I'd never been so relieved to get to my car and leave that place behind. I still go camping, but now I'm always on edge. That stranger may never have done anything, but the memory of him standing in the dark, silently watching, is enough to remind me of the dangers that sometimes lurk just out of sight. This happened just last year, and thinking about it still sends chills down my spine. My wife and I had just moved into a charming old house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with tree-lined streets and cozy homes that all look out for each other. We thought it'd be a peaceful place to start our new life together. But one night something happened that I still can't explain. It was a Saturday, and my wife was working late. I was sitting in the living room watching a movie when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I brushed it off as shadows, or maybe the neighbor's cat. But then it happened again, a quick, subtle movement by the window. I looked over, and for a split second I saw someone. A man standing just outside our window, staring in. I froze. It wasn't the kind of casual glance someone passing by might give. This was intense, purposeful. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching me. He was wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face barely visible under the shadows. I stood up, trying to keep my composure, and moved toward the window. "Can I help you?" I called out, keeping my voice steady. But the moment I spoke, he turned and walked down the sidewalk, disappearing around the corner. I went outside expecting to see him on the street, but he was gone, like he'd never been there at all. I told my wife about it when she got home, and we both laughed it off as just some passerby, maybe even a harmless prank. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time it was around 2 a.m. I'd gotten up for a glass of water when I saw the same man standing in our backyard, looking directly into our bedroom window. I panicked and flipped on the lights, but just like before, he disappeared before I could catch a real glimpse of him. We called the police, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested installing security cameras, which we did the very next day. We haven't seen him since, but every now and then when I'm up late or hear a noise outside, I can't help but check the window, half expecting to see him standing there again. That man's face, or what little I could see of it, haunts me. I still wonder why he was watching us, what he wanted. Maybe it was nothing, maybe he just enjoyed scaring people. But there's a part of me that fears he'll be back someday, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make his presence known again. It was late one night, and I was driving back from a friend's place. The road was pitch dark, and there weren't any other cars in sight. About halfway through the trip, my gas light came on. I figured I could make it another few miles, but soon enough I realized I wouldn't make it back to town without filling up. Eventually, I spotted a gas station sign up ahead. Relieved, I turned in and pulled up to the pump. But when I stepped out of the car, I noticed something strange. The lights on the sign were flickering, and the building looked completely dark. I walked up to the entrance hoping someone might be inside, but the place was abandoned, broken windows, cracked tiles, and dusty shelves empty of products. I quickly turned back to my car, but just as I did, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure was standing in the doorway of the building, barely visible in the dim light. My first thought was that it was a homeless person or someone who had taken shelter there, so I called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" There was no response. The figure just stood there watching me, silent and unmoving. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back. Then, as if he'd been waiting for me to turn, the figure started walking toward me slowly, almost in a trance. I bolted for my car, scrambling to unlock the door and get inside. I managed to start the engine just as the figure reached my window. For a split second, I glanced over and saw his face, pale with empty dark eyes staring right at me. I hit the gas and sped off, not looking back. As I drove away, I saw him standing in the road through my rearview mirror, watching me until he faded into the darkness. To this day, I have no idea who or what that figure was. I've never been so scared in my life. Now, every time I drive that route, I make sure I have a full tank. I'd rather break down in the middle of nowhere than stop there ever again. Last summer, I decided to spend a weekend at a small lake cabin I'd rented. It was in a remote area, quiet and surrounded by woods, perfect for a bit of solitude. The first day was amazing, full of fishing, swimming, and sitting out by the water enjoying the sounds of nature. As the sun began to set, I was heading back toward the cabin when I noticed something odd. Across the lake near the shoreline stood a man. He was just standing there, still as a statue, facing my cabin. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood up, and I couldn't make out his face. At first, I thought he was a fellow camper or someone out for a walk. But as the minutes passed, he didn't move or make any attempt to come closer. He just stood there staring in my direction. A sense of unease crept over me, but I tried to brush it off. I went inside, locked the doors, and tried to ignore it. Later that night, I heard faint footsteps outside. It was close to midnight, and I'd nearly fallen asleep when the sound woke me up. My heart started pounding as I realized someone was walking right outside my cabin. I got up as quietly as possible and peeked out the window. There he was, the same man from the shoreline, now standing in the shadows near the edge of the porch. His face was still hidden, but he was definitely watching the cabin. I felt trapped, like a deer being stalked by a predator. I didn't want to confront him, but I didn't know what else to do. After a few tense minutes, I mustered the courage to flip on the porch light. The instant I did, he turned and disappeared into the trees without a word. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every sound amplified in the silence of the cabin. The next morning, I left the lake and cut the trip short. When I got back to town, I told a few friends about the experience, and one of them mentioned that he'd heard of similar sightings around that lake. People had seen strange figures near their cabins, silent watchers who would vanish into the woods at dawn. I still don't know who that man was or why he was watching my cabin. All I know is that I'll never go back to that lake again, no matter how peaceful it seems in the daylight. When I first bought my house, it seemed like a great deal. It was an old, charming two-story with a spacious backyard and plenty of character. The only thing that put me off a little was the basement. It was dark, cramped, and had an eerie feeling about it that I couldn't quite shake. One night a few weeks after moving in, I was doing some cleaning in the basement. I had a single dim bulb overhead casting long shadows across the room. As I was organizing some old boxes, I heard what sounded like faint footsteps coming from behind me. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the house settling. But then I saw something. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving along the wall, a tall, human-shaped shadow that seemed to glide across the room. I froze, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. But when I looked directly at the wall, there was nothing there. I quickly finished what I was doing and got out of there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but a few nights later, I heard strange noises again, this time sounding like a low, raspy breathing. It was faint, but it was there, coming from the direction of the basement. That night I decided to leave a light on down there, thinking it might help. But as soon as I got into bed, I heard the light switch click off on its own. I grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly went down to investigate. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the basement was pitch black, and the air felt thick, like I was being watched. I didn't see anything, but that feeling of something watching me, lurking in the shadows, was overwhelming. I ran back upstairs, locked the basement door, and haven't gone down there since. I've thought about moving, but part of me feels like I'm trapped, like whatever's in that basement is just waiting for me to come back. A couple of months ago, I was driving home late at night from a work trip. The highway was nearly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. It was well past midnight, and I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but dark fields and distant tree lines. After driving for what felt like hours, I noticed a car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another car on the road. But as time passed, it stayed right on my tail, never passing, never falling back. I was getting a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off as a coincidence. Then the car's headlights flashed once, then twice, as if signaling me. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a figure sitting in the driver's seat, but his face was obscured by shadows. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car matched my speed, staying right behind me. At one point, I tried to pull over, thinking maybe he would pass me. Instead, the car slowed down as well, stopping a few yards behind me. I sat there for a few moments, my heart racing, not sure what to do. Then, without warning, the car's headlights switched off, leaving me in complete darkness. Panicking, I pulled back onto the road and floored it. I didn't see the car follow me, but after a few minutes, I glanced in my mirror and saw those headlights again, coming up fast behind me. This time, I didn't slow down or stop. I drove straight through the next town without looking back. When I finally reached my destination, the car was nowhere in sight. I still have no idea who that stranger was or what he wanted, but I know that feeling of being followed has stuck with me ever since. Now, every time I'm driving alone at night, I keep a close eye on my mirrors, wondering if I'll see those headlights again. A couple of years ago, I was on a camping trip with some friends deep in the mountains. We'd set up camp near a clearing at the edge of a dense forest with a small hill overlooking our site. The first night went smoothly, just stories around the campfire and stargazing before drifting off to sleep in our tents. The next night, however, things took a strange turn. Around midnight, I woke up feeling like someone was watching me. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just nerves. But as I lay there, I heard a faint crunching sound outside, like footsteps slowly moving closer to the tent. I held my breath, listening, but the sound stopped. Unable to fall back asleep, I eventually got out of the tent to stretch my legs. As I looked toward the hill, I froze. Standing at the top was a tall, shadowy figure, perfectly still staring directly at our campsite. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. I thought about waking up my friends, but part of me didn't want to alarm them if it was just my imagination. So I waited, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. Minutes passed, and it still didn't move. Finally, I decided to turn back into my tent, hoping it would be gone by morning. The next day, I told my friends about the figure, half expecting them to laugh it off. But one of them, Sarah, looked at me, her face pale. She'd seen it too, she said, around the same time as me, but she'd been too afraid to come out and look. On our last night, we made sure to stay together, all of us huddled around the campfire. None of us slept well, and to this day we still talk about the shadowy figure on the hill, wondering who or what it was and why it was watching us so intently. A few weeks ago, I was driving home after visiting a friend who lived a few hours away. The drive was long and mostly through empty rural roads, with only the occasional gas station or rest stop breaking up the darkness. It was late, and I was looking forward to getting home and going straight to bed. About halfway through the drive, I stopped at a small gas station to stretch and grab a drink. The parking lot was empty except for one other car parked a bit away with no one inside. I shrugged it off, paid for my drink, and headed back to my car. A few minutes after pulling back onto the road, I felt a strange sensation, like I wasn't alone in the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing unusual, but that feeling wouldn't go away. Then out of nowhere, the air in the car turned freezing cold, and I heard a faint whisper just behind my shoulder. I quickly turned, but there was no one there. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to convince myself that I was just tired and imagining things. But then I heard the whisper again, this time clearer. "Don't look back." My heart pounded, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, afraid of what I might see if I looked behind me. I drove the rest of the way home without glancing in the mirror, every second feeling like an eternity. When I finally got home, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I don't know if it was just my imagination, but since that night, I've avoided driving alone on that stretch of road. And every time I get in my car, I can't help but check the back seat just to be sure I'm alone.